Mercurian's atonement, we see a significant fountain scene through three centers of consciousness. Firstly, through Cecilia's, then Bryony's, followed by Robbie's perspective. In all three of these centers of consciousness, foul impressions are formed due to misunderstandings, however they escalate differently. Bryony's hostile attitude towards Robbie escalates to her enforcing her stubborn opinion that he is a maniac rapist, and as we know, there are severe consequences to this assumption. Cecilia's dislike that is displayed in this fantasy then escalates to a deep love for Robbie. Cecilia's dislike for Robbie is made known to the reader before we meet Robbie. She mentions that he wants to go to medical school after a literature degree in the start of chapter 2. She then describes it as pretentious and presumptuous, which shows her dislike towards him, as it was her father who would have to pay. Her snide remarks to Robbie's education pursuit shows her negative thoughts on Robbie's character. This then emphasizes when there are slight lingerings towards Robbie, as she would have liked to check her appearance before going out to Robbie. When Cecilia makes negative comments towards Robbie, it is then juxtaposed when she says things that makes the reader suspicious that there is something between them. In Cecilia's center of conscience, she takes a feeling that she feels jittery in his presence, and of course that she wanted to check her appearance before going out to see him. This implies an underlying attraction towards him, but at times it is overpowered by her dislike towards him. The fountain scene is significant as it portrays the struggle and eventual transition of feelings. At the fountain, Robbie offers to help Cecilia with a vase of flowers. However, when declining his help, there is a power struggle. This struggle shows Robbie wanting to help Cecilia due to his feelings for her and his good nature, and the struggle also shows Cecilia's need to be dominant and decline masculine authority. She shows great dislike towards Robbie when rejecting his help. In the fountain scene, Bryony shows her foul impression of Robbie. She describes Robbie as the only son of a humble cleaning lady, which shows Bryony's acknowledgement of class division and therefore looks down on him. She shows this by making a little story about Robbie and Cecilia, and in doing so she calls him a humble woodcutter, and Cecilia being the princess. We can see Bryony's thought process escalate to the assumption that because he's lower class, he's then an antagonist. From Bryony's perspective, she meshes her clueless observation with her wild imagination. What was less comprehensible, however, was how Robbie imperiously raised his hand now, as though issuing a command when Cecilia dared not dissipate. Mercurian adds this sentence to show Bryony's misinterpretation of what occurred, which represents her foul impression of Robbie. Bryony then accuses Robbie of blackmail, threat, as now he has become an antagonist in Bryony's twisted version of reality. The difference between these two feelings toward Robbie highlights two issues that I will cover. One is Robbie and Cecilia's inevitable love due to the seesawing of emotions, and the second is Bryony's dangerous characteristic of confusing reality with fiction, and her melodramatic one-sided take on life as she misinterprets the scene. The fountain scene shows the dislike for Robbie that Cecilia has. This underlying dislike, contrasted with the seesawing emotion transition to a lingering towards him, foreshadows an inevitable love story between the two. In the fountain scene, we witness the hostile manner in which Cecilia acts towards him, and then she takes her clothes off in front of him. Mercurian then adds lots of sexual tension between two characters in both perspectives, like how irresistible or even delicious she found putting the blame on Robbie, or how he stood there dumbly watching her darkened hair swing heavily across her shoulders, drenching her blouse, in Cecilia's perspective. And then in Robbie's center of consciousness, he thinks intensely of the fountain scene in the bathtub. He then talks of her in a sexual manner, describing her raw body and the triangular darkness her knickers were supposed to conceal. He then describes her as almost like a statue of beauty. This take on the fountain scene and Cecilia's lingering towards Robbie, even though she despises him, shows the reader that there's an impending love story and atonement. In the fountain scene, there's a transition of feelings between Robbie and Cecilia, but Bryony's stubbornly continues to think foully of Robbie. This is ironic as she initially wasn't in the scene, nor does she take part in it, yet she derives an opinion from it, and enforces it to certain consequences from the window. From the window, Brownie talks of what she sees as a sequence or a scene, as if life was her own personal canvas that she would paint widely with her untamed imagination. She talks of fairy tale castles and princesses, as well as a drowning scene followed by a rescue, and a fictional marriage proposal. This all supports the idea that Brownie views life as if it was her pen and paper, where if she thinks of something, it can happen. And in her Trials of Arabella, she wrote it as a melodrama. Therefore, her views on the character of Robbie, she thinks of him as a villainous antagonist with one side and no further explanations or possibilities. Brownie is portrayed as a clueless juvenile girl who can't differentiate between reality and fiction, and therefore improvises things that she makes up in her mind into life, and then believes that it is the way it is. As she said, she was able to send thoughts and feelings from her mind to her readers. Therefore, from seeing the fountain scene, she derived foul thoughts about Robbie, and then sent thoughts and feelings from her mind, but this time not to the reader, but to others that then arrested Robbie. Brownie believes that Robbie had power over Cecilia to strip, as she pictured the scene as Robbie commanding Cecilia through immoral prospects such as blackmail and threat, which shows the extent to how much Brownie misinterpreted the scene, as it was actually Cecilia who was gaining dominant authority by refusing help from Robbie, and then taking the power and blaming the breaking of the vase of Robbie. In some ways, this was Cecilia taking advantage of Robbie and his good nature, which gave her ability to blame him. But Brownie foolishly misinterpreted it as Robbie taking advantage of Cecilia. McEwen uses this irony to emphasize Brownie's fantasizing manner. This fountain scene is significant as the reader gets a glimpse of Brownie's dangerous trait of being a child writer. Watch the transition of emotions between Robbie and Cecilia. This transition, plus Brownie's misinterpretation, provides the reader an idea that there will be a love story, but a conflict, as Cecilia's little sister thinks foully of him and believes him to have commanded Cecilia to take her clothes off. This displays the progression of Brownie believing that Robbie demanded Cecilia to take her clothes off, to raping her in the library, therefore raping Lola in the woods.